set to pursue their dreams with confidence. Since this series began, we've had the privilege of hearing women leaders discuss how they cast their fears of risk aside and let curiosity and creativity guide their decision-making. We've learned how failure can be transformative, and we have seen how being uncomfortable in the space of unknowing, as one speaker said, can spark amazing new discoveries. These stories and the lessons we've learned from them have inspired all of us, including our alums. So many of you have joined us here tonight, thanks to our strong alumni network. I'm looking forward to hearing tonight's speaker, writer, podcaster, scholar, and Smith medalist, Simran Sethi. Thank you for being here with us tonight, Simi. I also want to thank Renee Hevelo, Director of Operations and Special Program at the Jill Kerr Conway Center, and her team for organizing this lecture series. And now, Boriana Mikic, Associate Dean for Integrative Learning, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, everyone. As Kathy said, I'm Boriana Mikic, Associate Dean for Integrative Learning and the Rosemary Bradford Hewlett Professor of Engineering. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Simran Sethi, Smith Class of 1992. Simran is a multimedia journalist, academic, and public speaker who is endlessly curious about science, sustainability, food, and the people and places that nourish us. Named one of the 50 most influential global Indians by Vogue India and the Environmental Messenger by Vanity Fair, Simran has written for outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Guernica, and The Guardian, and was designated one of the top 8 women saving the planet by Marie Claire. Simran is a senior fellow at the Oakland Institute here in the United States, researching and reporting on food justice and ways to forge a resilient, just food system. She's visiting faculty at John Cabot University in Rome and the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Palenzo, Italy. She's a former visiting scholar at the Cocoa Research Center based in the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad, where she completed training on chocolate making and the sensory analysis of cocoa. And she's the creator of The Slow Melt, the first podcast on the cultural and the environmental stories behind chocolate, and the winner of the 2017 Saveur Award for Best Food Podcast. As if that were not enough, Simran is also the author of Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love, named one of the best food books of 2016 by Smithsonian. It is about the story of changes in food and agriculture told through bread, wine, chocolate, coffee, and beer. We're thrilled to announce that a lucky few, this is my Oprah moment, that a lucky few of you have been selected via a random drawing to receive a signed copy of her book after tonight's event. Simran's talk tonight, Seed, Weed, Bloom, Cultivating a Wild and Precious Life, will explore her commitment to unearthing difficult stories while nurturing a taproot of joy and possibility. Thank you so much for joining us, Simran. The virtual floor is now yours.
Boriana, what a delight to be here. Please also thank Renee and everyone at the Conway Center for me. I am so grateful. I had an opportunity to speak with Elizabeth Miller before we gathered here together, and I want to say I'm so grateful to her for creating this endowed lecture series. And it was such a pleasure to meet President McCartney, and I'm just so grateful to all of you, viewers out there, alums and students and community members who have taken time to be with me today. These are very hectic times, I know, and you choosing to spend a portion of your evening with me means a lot to me, so thank you. I'd like to just offer a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from my mom's house on the colonized lands of the Saura, Catawba, Cherokee, Lumbee, Shakuri, Eno, and Occaneechi peoples in North Carolina. And I'm coming to you at a time that you all know is quite heavy. I want to just take a breath to honor the lives of so many that we have lost over the last year, but particularly acutely in this last week, the lives of those we should not have lost: George Floyd, Adam Toledo, and Daunte Wright. This presentation is called Seed, Weed, Bloom, and it's based around a vision that I held over the past 14 months while I was alone in Mexico trying to stay safe during the pandemic. I had gone there for a story about the smallholder farmers preserving the biodiversity of maize. And the center of origin and diversity for corn is Mexico. And they've been severely compromised by genetically engineered corn and trade agreements such as NAFTA that have really pushed a lot of US corn into that market. But the reason I was holding this vision of kind of seed, weed, bloom and the garden was I was thinking about my mom. And one of the things that she has held so dear and been such a steady force in her life is her garden. So what I hold today is that vision. Now I'm here. I've just come back to the United States less than a week ago, a few days ago. My mom is just there. And I also hold the vision of the community garden that has been tended on 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, in the shadow of Cup Foods at the site where George Floyd was murdered. There's a resident there named Jay Webb, and he talks about how people came to the site first to mourn, and now it's a place where food and flowers and healing grow. So that's something I hold and carry into this conversation, that there is always a place for healing and for growth. And when I say the garden is a metaphor, I truly mean it. I have failed at many attempts to grow vegetables. I'm a writer and scholar who focuses on food, but I also hate to cook. And I never, ever want to hear what you're cooking. It bores me. I just love to eat. I love to know the long stories of our food. And I share this to say that there are infinite ways to participate in nourishing ourselves and each other. But also as a reminder to those of you, especially those of you who are students, the last time I spoke at Smith was in 2009. And as Boreana mentioned, it was I'm a Smith Medal recipient. That's when I received the Smith Medal. And I stood up in Green Hall, got up on that stage. And of all the awards and recognitions that I've received, I have to say this one, I'm super humbled to have. This is the medal. If anyone can turn it into a medallion for me, please email me. I know we have a lot of work to do to make our institution better and stronger and more just, but there is something so precious that I believe in that Smith fosters, that the audacity and agency and authenticity makes me proud to be a Smith graduate. And I'm so grateful to be here with you today. But what I want students to know is I received this medal in honor of the work. You just heard about EcoHero and, saving the planet and all of this. But I've only taken one environmental course in my life. That was in my first year at Smith College. I took it pass fail. It was called the environment. I figured it was going to be pretty easy. It was not, and I failed it. And the reason I share that with you is to say you can be anything. You can fail a class and you can still receive a medal from your alma mater. You can learn anything. You can become anything. You are forces of nature, every single one of you. Do not forget this. Everything in my bio, in my resume, I learned to do on the job. Most recently, as a few months ago. So it was funny when Elizabeth Miller and I were talking, she's like, these are the parameters of this series. And this is kind of what I believed. And, women who were always kind of reinventing themselves and not, adhering to the norms. And I just thought, wow, that's a definition of who I am and how I have lived this very, I will throw Mary Oliver into a lot of this. I unapologetically love her. This very wild and precious life that I am so incredibly grateful for. As recently as a few months ago, I started a new job. I'm 50. I started a new job hosting a podcast on National Public Radio. And decades ago, producing, and being on camera for MTV News and then later NBC News as a tenured associate professor without a PhD. I only have an MBA, throwing a blanket over my head to make that podcast that was referenced earlier, that was named Best Food Podcast of the Year by Savor, doing an insane amount of research and travel for that book, chock full of botany, microbiology, chemistry, psychology, flavor science. Again, and the only science class I had taken before that was the environment. And then before that was in high school. So just to say, right up there with my Smith Medal, I'm just going to do this, brag a little bit, a revelation throughout. The journal Science called my book A Revelation Throughout. So again, just to say, wherever you are, whatever you are doing, keep envisioning something bigger than that and keep moving towards it. No matter what your family says, your professors say, the world tells you you can or cannot be, let the seeds of your hopes and your dreams guide you. This idea of life being a garden, you seed it, you weed it, you nurture it, and you make it bloom. And I think that if I had to summarize how I have managed this weird career trajectory of always doing a few things, never being able to fit them all on the Instagram bio, never having a clean LinkedIn, because everyone's like, well, what do you do? It's like, well, I teach, I write, I have a podcast, I host a podcast, I do public speaking, like I do a lot of things, and I wouldn't give up any of them. But, it was really about trying to understand what it was that I wanted. And so what I want to suggest is when we think about planting a garden, and of course, all you gardeners know this better than I, before you put a seed in the ground, you assess the land, you hold a vision, and you start to prepare. And so what I think that means, if we're sort of building that analogy, is that it's about spending time to get to know yourself and your values. My goals haven't changed since graduation. I was class of 92, right? So I started in 1988. And even in that first semester of that first year, I knew that I wanted to use everything I had to make the world better for those who are in difficult situations. And what I would say is I have been stubborn about that vision, but flexible about the means. So we used to call it women's studies. Now it's gender studies. I was a sociology and gender studies double major. I held a vision of I thought I would become a midwife, but there was a woman who came and spoke, class of 82, Lauren Lazen, to our sociology class. I was in Intro Soc with Rick Fantasia. And she came and talked about what she'd done with her major. And she was starting the documentary division at MTV News. I was like, oh, wow, music, cool. My parents never let us have MTV. I'd love to work for you. And I had, taken some college classes and AP classes in high school. And so I was going to graduate in 3.5 years. I ended up taking a semester off and moving to New York and working for Lauren. And what I thought the internship was going to be was about music. But what it was really about was story and storytelling. And I didn't know then that a seed had been planted. And throughout the work that I did, writing my thesis for each of my majors, doing all my, quantitative work, so much of it was built on observation and other people's lived experience. And I took a reproductive rights course at UMass. And I thought after that course, I would become a midwife or a doula. And later, I did actually train to be a doula, but at that point, it was for what I thought would be my own birthing experience. But again, I just share this to say, know what you want to do, but be flexible about how it shows up. Because I'm divorced, I don't have any kids. I use those skills for other birthing people, and also during the births of my 2 nephews. I was my sister's doula. But the thing that I think held most resonance for me was trying to understand, outside of that particular literal birthing experience, what I could do to help people. I don't like this idea of saying that, like giving voice to the voiceless. I think it's more about amplifying voices that tend to be quiet or tend to be silenced or not heard. That there are certain voices that we know, we can put a race and gender and identity to them possibly, that get heard a lot over and over again. And I wanted to hear from a different group of people. And I wanted to do whatever I could to make sure whatever platforms I had were amplifying those voices. So I did end up returning to work for Lauren Lazen, our Smith graduate, fellow Smith grad, at MTV when she decided to create a documentary on the rise of neo-Nazism in popular music. This was back in 1992. Unfortunately, the same issues we were covering then on youth unemployment, on a pandemic. I actually took an HIV/AIDS test on camera because of the rise of HIV/AIDS in India. I went on to become the news anchor for MTV Asia. But all of these things, again, were to simply say, like, there's so many more stories that we can hold and so many lived experiences we can understand. I didn't expect that part of that journey would entail a deep return to myself and a real reassessment of what it was that I wanted to do and also what it was that I was made of. And there have been two instances in my life where I really had to ask myself, why are you doing what you do? I wish that I had asked that question more often and sooner. And I wish that I had known early on that what we call failure, if we look at it in nature, there is no failure. There is time when things go fallow. There are natural life cycles. Some are short, some are long, but no one tells a marigold, oh, you died off after a season, you have failed. No, so I am trying to reinvent that term for myself. But whether we use the word failing or not, what I want to say is that it's a muscle. And just like any other muscle, it can get weak or it can become strong. And I wish that is one that I had learned, because what I learned at Smith was to excel. And this was already, I was primed for this, right? Because I come from an immigrant family where I was taught from an early age to succeed. I was never told anything about happiness. Sorry, Mom, but it's true. But I was told a lot about success. And I know that it came from a place of my parents. My mother was born in Uganda. My father was born in what's now Pakistan. They immigrated here to the United States on the invitation of the National Institutes of Health for my father to continue his cancer research. All they wanted was for their children, which is my younger sister who went to Hampshire, and myself to have better lives. That's what we all want. That's what I want for all of you, regardless of your station in life, student or alum. But what I didn't realize was that involved more balance than I could have fathomed. It involved rest. It involved light, air, laughter, joy. All I did was bury my head in a book and try my very best to walk a tightrope of a very narrow definition of success. When I veered off of that tightrope, I became a yoga teacher. And I remember my father saying, and I did it because it brought me joy. But I remember my father saying, you didn't even need a high school diploma to do that. And it was such an interesting moment because that's when I had to decide what is more important to me. And when I got divorced and was, implored by my family, why are you doing this? It was the right time to have a baby and do all the maternal things. I knew that it was the right decision for me. And so the reason I'm sharing these things is to say professional or personal, those lines are very blurred for me. When you become a public figure, part of your life, I think if you want to connect with other people, you're always sharing a bit of your life and maybe a bit more than you feel comfortable with. But I share it to say that my life is quite seamless. And what I have learned is that deep taproot of my joy is something that I need to constantly touch into. And it's something that is still quite unfamiliar to me. I've done it on these rare occasions that I've cited. But what I wish I had done for so much longer was return to it again and again, to recognize that the roots were deep and that endings were prolific, and that those endings would beget beginnings and they would beget endings And that would keep going on and on. So what you have to do, I think, is make a distinction between what is seed and what is earth. I told you I cared about making things better, and I kind of knew that. I knew that intuitively, right? But it didn't crystallize for me until 2004. So I was 34 years old in business school. And we spent some time thinking about this idea of calling in my MBA program. It was this first sustainability program in the United States that was accredited, right? The first MBA program focused on sustainability. And my friend David, we were working on this together, and he said, what you do is you share information that helps people make decisions that will help them have better lives. So there was a bit of a detour there, right? It wasn't a straight line per se, but it was sharing information that could facilitate transformation, that my job was to be more of that doula, right? Not the one birthing per se. And that has become my ground. The book, the podcast, the talks, they're all the seeds. And I was doing that work, but I didn't come into that awareness of what it meant to be a storyteller until that conversation with David. I honestly never thought about much of anything, right? Until I started to feel inauthentic, until I started to get called all these audacious titles and win beautiful medals and think to myself, why don't I feel all those things? Why don't I feel medal worthy? Why don't I know what to do with an Emmy? How am I best of anything? And I want you to understand, or I want you to plant, not even plant a seed, I want you to fertilize your ground of confidence. And I don't even know if I have to say that anymore, because what excites me so much is how the Smithies of today are so fearless. Like you amaze and humble me. I know I sound like I'm 150 years old, but it's true. You know the system's broken, and you teach me every day how to build anew, not to conform to this particular structure just because we've always done it that way, but to say, tear it down, start again, begin again. You can plant a new field, right? You can clear a new place and make something beautiful grow where something destructive once lived. And that is what is so inspiring. The way I invite you with what my 50 years have taught me, the way I think you can fill up yourselves and keep going. And I say this having been perilously close to burning out hours ago, is to seek nourishment. And while you're asking yourself what builds me, also ask yourself what fills you up, what nourishes you. I denied myself so much when I was walking that tightrope, right? Be with those who are invested in not only your success, but in your well-being and in your joy. And be gentle with yourselves, because this is what is required to fortify yourselves for what you can't control. And I learned this in nature. They say in vineyards, I wrote a book about biodiversity. I gave up my tenured job and spent 5 years on 6 continents learning about agricultural biodiversity, right? A lot of time researching, a lot of time in the field. And I remember one viticulturist saying to me, stressed vines produce the best wine, right? So the more stress the grapes had, the more aroma and the sweeter the grape would be. So I use that. I come back to that sometimes as a touchstone, right? To remember that I can take this, but I have to grow my capacity to hold everything. And that I have been a little bit lacking in, right? I have been impatient. And so again, I turn to nature, and I remember you can't rush a plant. It takes what it takes, but you can fertilize and you can water and you can nourish and you can plant in optimal light. So I urge you to find your light and to bask in that glow. You have so much ahead of you. The world is still opening up. I work with a Smith student right now. Her name is Juliet. I'm not going to fully call her out. But I have talked to Juliet about her career and her life. And what I've said over and over is, Juliet, no matter what you think you're going to be doing, look at me. I'm not doing any of the things I thought I would be doing. So always know you have the capacity for something more and something different. And hold on to your vision, but let that grip be a little soft, right? Know that there are many ways to nourish. There are many ways to tend. and that your world is just opening up before you. I swear on everything holy, on all things chocolate, you do not yet fully know. I do not yet fully know. So get comfortable with pruning ideas, with weeding goals, with weeding out anyone or anything that doesn't serve you. And doing that in service of a bigger yes. There is absolutely no way. Madeleine Albright said this, right? I can do it all, but not all at once. Say no for that bigger yes. Get comfortable with messiness, with discomfort, with uncertainty. I can't tell you how to do this because I'm still learning it right now. But I go back to the garden and to that moment when things look fallow, but a lot is gestating. Or I go back to the births that I attended. And birth, as anybody who has birth can tell you or been witness to birth, it's messy. There's blood and mucus and literal shit, there are guttural moans and pain, and it is holy, and it is miraculous, and it is the most extraordinary moment to bear witness to. And it's quite akin, I have been told by death doulas, to being in the presence of someone who's passing. And that one has been hard for a lot of us. It's a tough time to be saying this in this year, in this week, in this moment. But I invite you to also try to honor absence. I have learned more about loving people from their absence. And also, not kind of contradictorily, not conversely, realizing that I'm not alone. That also comes from the poem, right, by Mary Oliver. What is it you plan to do with your one precious, wild and precious life? Is from The Summer Day, but in Wild Geese, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you about mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Fast forwarding here. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. And I know that Mary Oliver is very, very popular, and you can, I'm referencing poems that you can find on a mug at the mall, but both are true. I love her, and many people love her. Truth is multiple and expansive. And that's something it took me a long time to also realize, was to get really confident in my truth. That is what is going to lead us into our tasting. Because for a long time, I didn't know that I could trust myself. I gave away so much of my power to scholars or to, in the realm of food, to critics or to, connoisseurs of this or that. My roots didn't feel deep. I didn't realize that I had something to offer, or when I did, I always thought about it as being something so very singular that I could only do alone. But we are part of a family of things. Our identity is not singular. Our success is not singular. We are interdependent. We learn from each other and we grow stronger because of each other. The book I wrote, it's generally discussed the way it was introduced earlier. I wrote those words, learning about changes in food and agriculture through bread, wine, coffee, chocolate, and beer. But it's really about agricultural biodiversity. No country is self-sufficient any longer in this era of globalization in having the food resources to feed themselves. So what I mean by that was a clunky way of saying it, is that we feed each other and we need each other, right? So a lot of the genetic material, a lot of the vegetables and the fruits and the grains and all the processed foods, all these things that we eat, they come from all over the world. They're zooming around, right? They have become subsidized, taxed, through trade agreements, they become distorted. And we now get things from all kinds of places rather than maybe decades ago, where they would come from a much closer area. Of course, there's a circle going on here, and a lot of people, particularly in this year, we've seen a lot of those supply chain challenges, and a lot of people are growing their own food. We've seen a huge surge in seed purchases, and we've seen a lot of people turning toward each other, toward community gardens. There's a big conversation we can have about all of that later, but what I want to say is that there is something extraordinary in reaching for what is near to us and who is near to us. And there is something urgent about that. In 2019, the most comprehensive report on biodiversity to date, that was written by 455 experts representing 50 countries, was released. And it showed that 1/8 of the world's plant and animal species are now at risk of extinction, which is a dramatic rupture of the rich diversity that underpins our very existence. So we're talking a lot about climate change. I want you to know that biodiversity is nested above and below that. It's part and parcel of everything you're hearing about climate change. We also need to worry about biodiversity. And, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has determined that of the 6,000 plant species used for food, only 9 account for 2/3 of the world's crop production. 1/3 of our global fish stocks are overfished, and most of our milk, meat, and eggs comes from just a handful of animal species. More than 1/4 of the 8,000 local breeds of livestock are now at risk of extinction. And once these things are lost, that agricultural biodiversity can't be recovered. So that's why I wrote this. But I wrote it through bread, wine, coffee, chocolate, and beer. Why didn't I write it through corn, wheat, and potatoes? Because I was sitting in my flat in Rome, researching at FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And I thought, for one, Michael Pollan already wrote an amazing book chapter on corn. Number 2, I don't really mind if rice leaves the earth, which is a little bit blasphemous in my house. But I realized that I was going to put these things on top. I was going to throw in a little wine for color, sprinkle a little, chocolate on top. And I came back to the United States after all this work in Italy, and I ended up meeting a chocolate maker who had been a botanist. And so he knew quite a bit about biodiversity, and he was trying to also preserve the biodiversity of cocoa. And once I visited him in his factory, I realized that's what I didn't want to miss, right? That's what I didn't want to have disappear. Chocolate has been my longest companion. Chocolate was every birthday cake. It was my wedding cake. It got me through my divorce. It's been getting me through this pandemic. It is a tremendous source of joy for me. Coffee wakes me up every morning. Beer is full of such conviviality. It's the world's most democratic beverage. There's just so many amazing things that we can learn through. And that's what I use chocolate for. So I'd love for everyone to now find their chocolates if they have them. If you don't find them and you're joining us on live or just don't have your chocolates with you, don't worry, you'll be able to see this later. And I also encourage you to pick up some nice craft chocolate and go through a tasting on your own. You'll also find a detailed chocolate guide in my book, but also you can find it like on the podcast, on my website. There's a million places you can find me talking about chocolate and giving you tips on what kinds of chocolate to buy, where to buy it, who to buy, how to consume it, right? So what we're going to do is line up our chocolates. It's amazing. The Conway Center went through and tied them so beautifully. I unwrapped it already, but put little dots on each of these chocolate samples, right? So the pink is the one we're going to taste first, then the orange, then the green. Also, please get yourselves a glass of room temperature water. We don't want it to be ice cold because that's going to chill your mouth, and I want your mouth nice and warm. We are approaching that moment when we are going to start to taste these chocolates. We're not scarfing them, we are tasting them. But I want to explain to you, I said I wanted to talk through these glorious foods, but I want to say something in particular about chocolate. There's a reason I stayed with chocolate so long, and not just because it's been my longest lover. It's because the story is so long, and it's one that's born out of such hardship. And a lot of people don't sometimes realize that I tackle difficult subjects because I try to reach for the parts that are bright and that show us we have agency. And I want to honor the person who taught me that. Her name is Sylvia Earle. She's an oceanographer. She was the first woman to walk untethered on the ocean floor. She used to be the head of NOAA. She is an extraordinary woman. And I remember I like met her, interviewed her. I've interviewed her several times. I was wringing my hands. You know, her book was talking about how 90% of, you know, fish stocks are depleted. And I was like, you know, Dr. Earle, whatever should we do? And this woman has been doing this work for her entire adult life. You know, we're talking about like something like 60 years. And she said the other 10%. And that lives in me. That is a big seed that she planted in me to remember the 10%. So for me, what that looks like in chocolate is to know that we think of chocolate as being one flavor oftentimes. If you think of like a, I don't know, a Hershey bar or a Kit Kat or something, but it has as much diversity as something like wine. There are actually over 14 different types that have been categorized of cocoa. It's grown in a thin band around the equator, 20 degrees north and south. The chocolates that we're tasting tonight come from 3 different origins: Ecuador, Philippines, and Tanzania. So 3 different continents. They're all around. You'll see it says itty bitty chocolate on there. I don't think you'll see it on the bar itself. So I'm going to tell you, they're all between 70 and 80%. Now, you may have seen those percentages on a chocolate bar in the store. If you're unfamiliar with what this means, a candy bar, like, you know, like, again, one of these like Snicker Hershey things, has about 10%. In order to be called chocolate bar, you have about 10% cocoa content. When you read 70, or whatever the percentage is, that is telling you the amount of cocoa inside of the bar. So it's the equivalent of like, I don't know, having like a caramel macchiato with extra syrup and whipped cream versus a shot of espresso. You're gonna get a much bigger, stronger pop in this chocolate. And in these particular chocolates, there's no nougat or caramel or biscuit or nut to distract us. These are, I chose these specifically, 2 ingredients: sugar and cocoa. Cocoa beans are very fatty beans, so they absorb a lot of aroma. And we humans have an extraordinary capacity for smelling, for holding and remembering smells. Up to 1 trillion is what the research indicates. But what I view chocolate as is not just this vehicle for fetishizing flavor, but as the long story of how we can help smallholder farmers. The majority of cocoa is grown by extremely poor farmers, mostly in West Africa. There are 3 lawsuits pending right now around child labor. Back in 2001, Mars, Ferrero, the Hershey Company, Nestle, all these big chocolate companies said collectively they were committed to combating child labor in cocoa growing communities in West Africa through a piece of voluntary agreement called the Harkin-Engel Protocol. And they were going to reduce the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa sector in Ivory Coast and Ghana, the top places where cocoa is grown, by 2020. Here we are in 2021, and the US Department of Labor funded a study by the University of Chicago that was released last October, showing that there are 1.58 million children harvesting cocoa in West Africa, which is a major increase since 2015, and that 95% of these children are performing hazardous work. So I don't want my joy to come at the expense of such suffering, and I want to empower you to find chocolate that also adheres to those standards. The chocolate we are tasting comes from a company called Askinosie. The long stories of each one of these chocolates can be found on their website if you'll just click on the bar, right? And go to, I guess we'll have to get you away. If you'll just jot down for yourself, it's the Ecuador, Philippines, and Tanzania bars. You can read about them because I see it's not written on the tiny chocolate. But what I want to say is this is part of a much longer story that started with the transatlantic slave trade that transported between 10 to 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. And that allowed for the expansion of cocoa and sugar. Those plantations grew because of this. We now call cocoa a commodity, but in that time, the most revolutionary commodity is what Tulane University professor by the name of Joseph Roach wrote. The most revolutionary commodity was human flesh. So I am aware of that with every piece of chocolate that I eat. And I want to empower you to understand this substance so you can help be part of this solution and help eradicate slavery from the cocoa supply chain. So what we're going to do is taste this chocolate with every one of our senses. And we're gonna do a sample of 2 of them. And I'm gonna leave you one on your own because I wanna make sure that there's time for questions. Now, you see this small bar and you're like, well, I guess there's just enough to put it all in my mouth. But look at what I'm doing. I've broken off a piece the size of my pinky fingernail, if not smaller. And that's all I want you to break off. If you listen to your chocolate, mine's in the wrapper, so I'm not gonna do a great job now, and it's also getting melty because I've held it in my hands. You would actually hear a nice tight snap. That's a sign of how the crystalline structure of the cocoa was restructured, right? So there's a sound that's telling you a story. Of course, if we looked at the colors of the chocolate, it's starting to melt in my fingers. We can feel this touch, right? It's about 50% cocoa butter. When you read butter, it's not dairy, it's endemic to the cocoa bean, it's just the fat. We call it butter. So I'm getting nice and messy now. Holding this up to my nose, all the aromas are coming out. I like to open my mouth slightly so the aroma can go back through my nose and also through the retronasal passage at the back of my throat. This is not pranayama. We're not in yoga doing like deep inhalation, light sniffs. You can cup your hand to really concentrate that aroma, right? Mouth lightly open. And then when you're ready, put that tiny little bite on your tongue and close your eyes. And let it coat your tongue. And often people will then ask, I'm going to keep talking, you can keep your eyes closed and just be with this. What do you taste? Now you can go online and find tasting notes. This probably says berries and plums or something. Whatever you find is the right thing. But what I love about this is there's a acidity here, like for me, like a ripe green, a sharp green apple, a Granny Smith. There's a brightness in this. I studied with over 200 experts in flavor. And the greatest lesson was 2 things. One, to find a vocabulary for it. So there are tasting wheels you can find for cocoa. I have them on my website, anywhere you want, on the Slow Melt website, in the book. But to find a way to describe what it is that's coming up for you and to be confident in that, because no one knows your taste better than you. No one can tell you what you find there. If you grew up in India, maybe your reference for fruit when you first think of fruit is mango. If you grew up in, I don't know, Washington State, maybe it's a red apple. These all are so unique and specific to us, right? Take a sip of water and try to cleanse your palate. Do a little swish. And I want us to move on to the orange dot chocolate. Actually, no, excuse me, to the green. We're gonna let you do the orange on your own later. Let's move to Tanzania. Little homage to my mother's African homeland. Same thing, take a look. Again, when you have a bigger bar, give it a snap, right? And if you line these up beside each other, you would see that the color is actually a little bit different on each bar. And this maker, I mentioned, I chose a very specific maker. His name is Sean Askinosi. He signed an amicus brief along with 25 other chocolate makers onto the case, the child labor case that is before the Supreme Court. I urge you to go to the website slavefreechocolate.org and take a look at the makers who are signed on to that, who are part of that list, because they have culled a list of chocolate makers that are committed to ensuring that their supply chain isn't coming from labor that is in any way compromised. Go ahead and do the same process. Take a look, let it get a little warm in your fingers, cup your hand, take a smell. You should notice, even though these are both just chocolate, there's something very different in this aroma. And then go ahead and put it in your mouth when you're ready. The second thing, and the final thing I'll say, so we have time for questions, that these flavor experts said to me was keep expanding. And that's what I'll leave you with. With all the things that I hope that you'll do, I hope that you understand the way I've cultivated this weird entrepreneurial life is by staying curious. I have let my touchstones be what makes me happy and what I believe is of greatest service, but also remaining open and curious to what that might be. And the same goes for flavor. The way to expand your awareness and understanding of the terroir of chocolate or wine or beer or bread or tomatoes or whatever it is that makes you happy is to simply taste more. And not just to taste another tomato or another piece of chocolate, but to expand your sensory library, to taste it all, to taste the mango and the mangosteen, to taste the chocolate and the beer, to taste the thing that you don't like as much as the thing you do. We never use those terms in sensory analysis. We know that everything good and bad is a teacher. And so I invite you to approach chocolate the same way. Everything in your life will teach you something if you give it the chance. So thank you all for your attention and for your support. And I'm really excited for your questions.
Simran, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. And we're going to open it up for Q&A from the audience. So as Jennifer's typed for you in the chat, put your questions in the Q&A feature and we'll get to as many as we can here. So we've already got them coming in.
Excellent. Can I go ahead and answer them?
Absolutely. If you want to, you field them or I can help too. So
I got them. I've got them right now. Indrani, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I have so many interests, Anonymous. I do. I'm so tired. How do I manage my time? Woo, not well. How do I know when a project is finished and when it's time to move on? Sometimes I don't. And that is something that is also intuitive. I'll tell you what I had to do this year that's been a real struggle for me is learn when I was alone that my ideas were my companions and that my creativity is also a companion and is a source of joy for me. I don't know how to play. My nephews are sometimes like just eye rolling. I don't know how to play with them, but I do know how to think thoughts about a lot of things and have book ideas and have story ideas. And some of them come to life and some of them don't. And I used to push so hard for some of them to manifest. And now I'm starting to realize it was the process. That's all that this was meant to do. And I'm learning to make peace with that. But I think the more we touch in, like the clearer the life cycle becomes, right? And again, not holding that external view that the only way it's fully and properly birthed is if your podcast becomes this, or you make this salary, or you're on this TV show, or whatever it is. But that the touchstone is, am I happy? Am I satisfied? Did it give me what I needed? And we can only know that if we ask that question in advance. So I'm just starting to learn that process. In terms of managing my time, I don't do a good enough job, and that's because I'm wildly undisciplined. But I will tell you what I am really protecting now is my morning time. There's a great field of research called chronobiology. There are clocks in our entire body, in every one of our cells, in our muscles, in our, everything has a different timing. We think about it with the seasons or the sun, but it's all within us too. And there are times in the day, you've heard this whole like night owl, I'm a night owl, I'm an early bird thing, but it can get a lot more nuanced than that. So what I've really started to think about is like, when am I most excited about tackling X kind of work? And now I used to say, oh, I should have all my calls at 10 a.m. And now I realize that is my precious time to be doing my creative work. And again, that's something I've only been able to learn about and touch into in this year, but starting to really pay attention to my ebbs and flows. When am I really tired? When in the afternoon am I reaching for the chocolate? Is it always 4 o'clock? Would it make more sense to take a 20-minute nap? Like, what do I need to do for myself? And I've been meditating since 1999, but I'll tell you, there's just so much I did not know, and I still am discovering about myself. So if you have, so thank you for the question. If you want to get in touch with me, it's simransethi.com. The email is admin@simransethi.com. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram @simransethi. You can also add me on LinkedIn, but I don't ever use it. What fulfills me today? What do I enjoy today? I'm obsessed with microgravity and astronauts. I'm in conversation with the man who was the 8th Black astronaut to space. His name is Bob Kerbeam. And I've just started to try to comprehend weightlessness. And I've also become quite obsessed with time, as I shared. There's a group of indigenous peoples who sees time in the other direction. So the future is the past is ahead of us and the future is behind us. And I just keep sitting with these things because time has become such a fuzzy construct in this year, you know? And I was in Mexico. It was always hot and bright, like and sunny and warm and gorgeous, but also like I just started to, the days just melted into each other. And so just becoming reacquainted with what brings me joy, poetry. I've been so grateful for all these Zoom poetry readings. Wow, the amount of meditating and poetry I've been able to receive in this last year has been such a blessing. So those are the things. Yeah, and jumping on a trampoline. I have a little mini trampoline that brings me a lot of joy. Hi, classmate Liz. How do I prioritize? I lived in, first I lived in Capon, then I lived in Washburn. After I did that stint at MTV News, I couldn't get back into Capon. With so many interests, how do I prioritize? I don't. I think that I just touch into whatever needs to be done. I'm also quite aware of, hey, Jenny, I'm also quite aware of balancing. It's not like I'm still paying off that MBA. Like I have no trust fund, you know, I have to earn a living. But what I realize more and more is that the living I earn is for me because I don't have children. I don't have a partner. So it's in service of what I need. And I realize what a privileged position that is. And so because I know it is so privileged, I really try to maximize that. Travel and going to restaurants were two of my greatest joys. And I have not done that in a long time. The last trip I actually made was to Svalbard. I mentioned not knowing anything about agrobiodiversity. The pinnacle of that was not actually the science, the little nice blurb from Science, but it was being invited to the Seed Vault at Svalbard to keynote the historic opening. That was just over a year ago. And I thought, if I never travel again, going to the North Pole and being with all those people I had written about, all my heroes who are saving the future of food, I'm good, you know? So that's what I do on a daily basis to connect with my source of joy and energy. I do not always have a source of joy. I spend at least 10 minutes meditating, which is lame, but that's about, so it tends to be more than that, but I definitely time out at least that much. And I write. I have so many journals from this year. I have a whole suitcase I brought back full of journals, and I will not be ready to read them for a long time, but I'm very grateful that I got this stuff out of my body. Jenny, shout out to you at Capon. Of course, I remember you so well. How do I know when something deserves my attention and curiosity and when I should let it go? I'm still learning, but I also now am not as stubborn as I once was on, again, what I think that life cycle is, what fruition is. And it's very new. I was very frustrated. I have spent 6 months talking to my astronaut. I call him my astronaut and he knows it, Bob. And it just wasn't coming together as a story. Like it hasn't fallen into place. And I had to make peace with these oceans of time I had spent, right? And again, wasted time. I tried to create a podcast that didn't go anywhere tied into chronobiology. These things happened, but then these other things happened instead. And so I'm just, as I get, older, I'm becoming more comfortable with things being what they are and maybe unfinished projects actually being finished. But I just had a different definition of what finished was before. So making peace with kind of what that looks like. Where did I get my MBA? I got my MBA at the Presidio Graduate School in the Presidio in San Francisco. Do I have a daily routine? I wake up, I sit outside with my coffee or my tea. I write, I meditate for 5 minutes. I read the news on my phone, Guardian, CNN, New York Times. And then I come back inside and I start to kind of get ready for the day. I listen to WNYC, Brian Lair, and that's how I get started. And then I log onto my computer. I spend most of my day in front of a screen. Right now, I'm working on a show that'll be coming up on Life Kit for NPR, the Life Kit podcast on anger with Lama Rod Owen. I hope you all will tune into that one. I'm also working on my syllabus for a course I'm teaching on food sovereignty and food communications at the University of Gastronomic Sciences. And I'm writing a piece on child labor and cocoa that I mentioned, and also an explainer on food insecurity, resources for people who are currently food insecure. So working on all of that all at one time. Any tips for humanities majors looking at MBAs? I don't think you need an MBA. That's what I would say. Still paying mine off. Do not think you need that degree. I think you can do whatever you want and learn anything you need to know about business outside of that. But again, you can email me and I'm happy to chat about it further. Have you ever felt stuck? Every single day of my life, including today. There's not a day that goes by that I don't wonder if I'm doing enough, or if I'm good enough, or if I've done enough, or any of these things. If you are struggling or confused or stuck or wondering, you are not alone. You are absolutely, I'm right beside you, struggling every single day. I didn't know if I'd make it through this year, and it's just a funny thing to be speaking to all of you, people I admire, and respect so much. So just know it all ebbs and flows. And when I feel stuck, I try to be with the stuckness now. I am holding myself a lot more gently, not out of some like epiphanic moment, because I didn't feel like I had a choice. It's just like that moment when you've been running and running and running and running, and you kind of fall down in the grass and you're panting and you're just like, I can't go on anymore. So that was me. That was me now. And so I'm starting to recognize and learn limits in a new way, and really appreciate what I do have as I move forward, and hold myself a lot more gently. You'd like to read my writing about child labor in cocoa? Absolutely. It will be on a website called The Counter. I have written some work I'm really proud of there on food insecurity. I was also on the San Francisco Chronicle podcast on Monday. The podcast is called Extra Spicy, where I laid out this whole thing. And if you go to my Twitter, you'll also see the podcast I did on children, on deforestation and all the social and environmental challenges in cocoa. But you can also hear them on the Slow Melt podcast, which is theslowmelt.com. Thank you, Denise, for my transparency and authenticity. I wish I had a choice, but it's just how I show up, and I'll say one last thing. I know we're hitting the time. When I wrote this book, I thought my farmers and my scientists would be my heroes, and I would tell their life stories. And my editor kept saying, more of you, more of you. And I was so angry. I was like, you want me to talk about me? That's self-indulgent. It's just all these things. No, what, my boring life? Like, why, how? And I became the connective tissue for my book. And what I realized is that all we want to do is feel a connection to each other. And science bears this out. It's not just conjecture. And so if anything I share about being vulnerable or scared or exhausted or an imposter resonates, I'm so grateful to you. I want our vulnerabilities to be more apparent, and I want our failures to be more apparent, because I think when we can share these things, it's like with stories, right? Then we take them on together, and the load becomes lighter when we work together. So again, you can find me in all the places. If you weren't able to get your question answered, sorry, I went on. And lots of love to you, Juliet, and to everyone I know who's joined today. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Oh, Simran, thank you so much. What an absolute gift to us to have you with us tonight. It was really, really a spectacular presentation and discussion, and we're really grateful. And I'd like to close by once again thanking Elizabeth Miller for making this event possible. Also Jennifer Kennedy and Jeff Heath for supporting us behind the scenes and ensuring that the successful technical delivery of this event. And finally, also to thank all of you for tuning in tonight and for the great questions that you've had. So take care and have a good night, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you again, Simran.
Thank you, Boriana. Thanks to all of you. Thanks so much. Be well.